This presentation is by Pauric Travers. It's entitled Colonel Arthur Lynch, Boer War Traitor, Great War Hero. And we'll sorry, Ian, you're admitting folk, and we'll kick off in a minute. Just want to say a few bits of housekeeping. We've muted you on entrance, and that's so that we aren't distracted. The speaker isn't distracted, and we can hear the presentation. This is one of a number of events. We've got another one coming up on November next. There will be an opportunity for question and answer at the end. So just put any questions in the comments in the chat box, and we'll come to you at the end. We might unmute you because it's quite, I think it's only 20 folks so far. So I'll pass it on to Ian to introduce Pauric.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm Ian Montgomery, the chair of the Antrim and Down branch of the Western Front Association, and you're very welcome to our October 2023 online meeting. And I'll not keep you very long with announcements. As I say, this is the October meeting. There will be another meeting in November. The details of that are on the website. So this evening is a great pleasure to welcome a distinguished scholar, academic and educator, Pauric Travers, to give tonight's talk. He's done wide range of historical books, including recently a book on Donegal during the Irish Revolution, 1912-1923, and I believe he's currently working on a book on Colonel Arthur Lynch, tonight's subject. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Pauric for this evening's talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian and Stephen, and thank you all of you for joining me from various locations. I'll try now to just share my screen, just so you will have something more pleasant to look at. Good. Okay. Colonel Arthur Lynch, Boer War traitor, Great War hero, ? Karl Marx once famously remarked that all history repeats itself, first as tragedy and then as farce. The epigram seems apposite in the case of Irish-Australian polymath and soldier Colonel Arthur Lynch, MP, 1861-1934. Lynch was sentenced to death for high treason in 1903 for leading an Irish brigade in the Boer War, only to accept a commission 15 years later to raise another Irish brigade, this time to fight on the British side in the First World War. In one narrative, the Boer War traitor became a Great War hero. In another, the opposite is the case. Neither version is sufficient or satisfactory. At first glance, Lynch's conversion was not all that unusual. Many Boer War leaders did something similar, while constitutional nationalists in Ireland saw no inconsistency in rallying to the Allied cause in the First World War. But Lynch's case was different, not least because of his republicanism and his commitment to the cause of France. Lynch was idiosyncratic, but his story does throw some light on the complex nature of identity and allegiance, and the dangers of simple binary explanations of attitudes to the Great War. Born in 1861 in the gold rush township of Smythesdale in Victoria, Arthur Lynch became in turn an engineer, a teacher, a mathematician, a writer, a journalist, a soldier, a doctor, and a politician. He was the fourth of 14 children of John Lynch, originally from near Ennis in County Clare, and Isabella MacGregor from Perthshire in Scotland. The Lynches were one of the famous 14 founding tribes in Galway, while the MacGregors claimed descent from Rob Roy MacGregor. It was an explosive mix. Arthur identified as Irish. He also considered himself Scottish and Australian at a time when a self-confident Australian identity was being forged. In South Africa, he became a citizen of the Boer Republic. As a child, Lynch lived for a time with his Scottish grandfather, Peter McGregor, in Ballarat. He took from him a preoccupation with manliness. A sickly child, he grew up immersed in physical activities, including boxing, athletics, and horse riding. Although he later had a reputation of being a dreamer and an intellectual, he extolled the virtues of courage, he admired men of action, and he wanted to be one himself. The parallel with Theodore Roosevelt is striking. Lynch met Roosevelt in 1901, shortly after his return from the Transvaal, and they formed an unlikely friendship. Lynch claimed Roosevelt tried to persuade him to accept a commission in the American Army, and when he was sentenced to death for treason, Roosevelt, by now the President of the United States, intervened on his behalf. John Lynch, Arthur's father, was a veteran of the infamous Eureka Stockade in Ballarat, the short-lived miners' revolt against the colonial authorities. His son Arthur inherited both his republicanism and his passion for Byron and Robbie Burns. However, Arthur was intent on making his own distinctive mark, which may explain why he chose to leave Australia in the late 1880s and never to return. Lynch lived in turn in Berlin as a student and in London and Paris, where he sought to sustain his literary endeavours by working as a journalist. In London, he became involved on the fringes of the Fenian movement. He reported on the Ashanti Wars in West Africa in 1895 for Alfred Harmsworth's Evening News. Harmsworth sent him to Paris as French correspondent of the newly established Daily Mail, where Lynch wrote a regular column entitled La Vie Parisienne. In Paris, he and his wife Annie became part of a literary circle which included Maud Gonne and, for a time, J.M. Synge. It was hardly surprising that late in 1899, Lynch accepted a commission for 3,000 francs to report on the Anglo-Boer War for Le Journal in Paris. He bought a Kodak camera and took lessons in its use. He estimated that between articles and photographs for various French, British, and American publications, he could earn about £500. Before departing, he presented his credentials to the Boer representative in Europe, Dr. Leitz. The Boer government wanted to influence international opinion and needed sympathetic coverage. So Lynch was given 5,000 francs, about £950, to cover his travel and expenses. However, shortly after arriving in the Transvaal, he accepted a commission as colonel to command the so-called 2nd Irish Brigade. The 1st Brigade was led by Colonel Blake and Major John McBride. While he didn't know much about the Boers, Lynch regarded the conflict as, quote, a little republic being attacked by an imperial power. While at the front, Lynch encountered Michael Davitt, who was later to become his mentor. Davitt recorded his very favourable impression in his diary. Visit from Colonel Arthur Lynch of the 2nd Irish Brigade, tall, soldierly looking, and much more presentable than either Blake or McBride. Is much smarter also in other respects. Appears to be well educated, gentlemanly young fellow, height 5'10", age 34 about, handsome regular features, dark complexion, and smartly dressed in kind of light uniform. Says his brigade is 130 strong, offered to amalgamate with Blake, but latter would not agree. The photograph on the slide is a part of Lynch's brigade, with Lynch mounted on a horse in front. Lynch's sojourn in South Africa was relatively brief. He arrived in January 1900 and he left again in July after the fall of Johannesburg. But it wasn't without some limited military distinction, a point which was acknowledged in the Times history of the war. Back in Paris and in America, he was feted as a hero. In Ireland, on foot of his exploits, he was nominated in his absence as a nationalist candidate for Galway and defeated Horace Plunkett, the Unionist candidate. Endorsing his candidature, John Redmond described him as a soldier of liberty. In his election address, Lynch declared that he was now committed to constitutional politics, not physical force, a development which was greeted by his former colleagues as a betrayal. The rivalry between the two Irish brigades persisted after the war and was intensified by a personal animus between Lynch and MacBride, not unrelated to Lynch's friendship with Maud Gonne. When Lynch travelled from France to England to take a seat in the House of Commons, he was arrested and charged with high treason. Rex v. Lynch commenced in the Royal Courts of Justice on the 21st of January 1903 and lasted 3 days. Lord Chief Justice Alberston was joined on the bench by Justice Wills and Mr. Justice Chenell. The prosecution team was led by the Attorney General, Sir Robert Finlay, assisted by Solicitor General Edward Carson. Lynch was charged with 4 counts of treason with 8 related overt acts. The overt acts were largely uncontested, and the case resolved itself into a complex legal argument about high treason and the nature of allegiance and citizenship. The charge of high treason was unusual. The definition derived from a statute of Edward III, which provided that if a man do levy war against our Lord the King in his realm, or be adherent to the King's enemies in his realm, giving to them aid and comfort in the realm or elsewhere, then such person be attainted and held guilty of high treason. Horace Avery, for the defence, unsuccessfully argued that Lynch's actions had occurred not in the King's realm, but in the Transvaal. Basically, therefore, he argued that he couldn't be guilty of treason. That argument was summarily rejected, but coincidentally in 1916, when Roger Casement was charged with treason, the same argument was advanced in defence of Roger Casement, that his treason had taken place not in the United Kingdom, but in Germany. But that was rejected out of hand by the judges, including none other than Horace Avery, who had argued the opposite in the case of Arthur Lynch at Lynch's trial. On the basis that Lynch's alleged crimes took place in South Africa, his defence also argued that the trial should take place there. This was rejected, as was the argument that the trial should take place in Australia, as Lynch was an Australian. Lynch said he claimed that he favoured that option, saying, "My blood is not ditch water. I never fought against Australia. If necessary, I will go out to Australia and stand my trial." It's not likely he would have had a very popular reception in Australia, because Australian troops had participated in the Boer War, and the Australians took a rather hostile attitude to Lynch. Citing the Naturalisation Act of 1870, the defence argued that Lynch was entitled to become a citizen of the Boer Republic, and as such could not therefore be guilty of treason to Britain. Lord Alberston, summing up, dismissed the notion that in a changing world, allegiance might be interchangeable. It would be a sad day if it could be supposed that subjects do not owe a duty, and a very high duty, to the country of their birth, or the country they have adopted, or to the country to which they owe their protection. The jury reached its verdict in record time of 36 minutes. Asked whether he had anything to say why the court should not sentence him to death, Lynch uncharacteristically resisted the temptation to add his own to the annals of Irish patriot speeches from the dock. He was duly sentenced to death. While the likelihood of a reprieve was widely touted, the outlook was at best uncertain. In the event, it was quickly decided that a sentence of life imprisonment should be substituted for execution. Rex v. Lynch had considerable legal significance. It established that while high treason was archaic, it remained the law of the land. Several precedents were set which had a significance, not to say a deadly impact, in the later Roger Casement and William Joyce trials. The trial had a profound impact on Lynch's career. Following a campaign on his behalf, he was released in January 1904, having served 19 months, but it was a fettered freedom, conditional on his taking no part in politics. He used the period to train as a doctor. For many years, he ran a medical practice in Haverstock Hill in London. He received a full pardon in 1907, and despite the lukewarm support of many of his colleagues in the Irish Party, he returned to Parliament as a nationalist MP for Clare in 1909. Lynch was 52 in 1914 when the war broke out, and well beyond the normal recruitment age. For reasons of character and outlook, he was never likely to remain comfortable on the sidelines. Philosophically and politically, he was a Republican, anti-imperialist, and a Francophile with a deep animosity for the Kaiser's Germany, which he saw as a threat to freedom and democracy. Lynch became convinced at an early stage of the inevitability of war and was a strong supporter of Britain's involvement in support of France. By his own account, when the war broke out, he offered his services to the British, Australian, and French governments. If such an offer was ever more than a rhetorical flourish, there is no record of a response. When a newspaper poked fun at the erstwhile felon espousing the British cause, Lynch denied any inconsistency. He had always stood in the cause of liberty. He considered the war as a turning point in the history of nations and the dawning of a new epoch. Lynch's early contributions to the war effort were from the sidelines, mainly in Parliament. Although he was frozen out of the leadership group of the Irish Parliamentary Party, he was an unusually active parliamentarian. The most common subjects of his interventions in Parliament after Irish affairs were the war and international diplomacy. He spoke frequently on issues such as the need for the unity of command in the Allied armies and the military potential of aircraft, an interest which derived from his background as an engineer. In his spare time, he developed a radio for use on aeroplanes, and in his medical practice, he specialized in the psychological traumas experienced by soldiers. Lynch had strong views on the kind of political and military leadership necessary for the prosecution of a prolonged conflict. He quickly concluded that Asquith did not possess the single-minded resolution required. Like his friend and patron, Lord Northcliffe, Lynch became a firm supporter of Lloyd George. He was critical too of Kitchener and other British generals. He assiduously cultivated his French military and political contacts, which dated from his time as Paris correspondent of the Daily Mail, and at least by his own account, often acted as an informal liaison with the French authorities. Lynch was critical of the rejection of conscription in his native Australia and disappointed at the level of Irish recruitment. Despite his preoccupation with the war, he maintained a strong interest in Irish affairs, criticizing the deferral of Home Rule and John Redmond's weakness on partition, which he abhorred. He detested the pro-German tendencies of Sinn Féin and criticized the 1916 Rising, but he described the executed leaders as heroes. He particularly regretted the loss of James Connolly, whom he admired. After 1916, he became increasingly critical of John Redmond's leadership of the Irish Party. Lynch's view of Connolly may be related to his growing closeness to the Independent Labour Party in Britain. In March 1917, Lynch was one of several Labour and Radical speakers who addressed a meeting at the Albert Hall to welcome the overthrow of the Tsar. He called for the creation of a republic in Russia, without which political freedom was impossible, and the creation of a ring of real republics in the British dominions, united together only by the interests of mutual defense. Lynch's interest in Russia cemented his friendship with English Labour MP James O'Grady, who went to Russia as an envoy from the British government. O'Grady later joined Lynch in his recruiting campaign in Ireland. Their friendship may have influenced his decision to join the Independent Labour Party early in 1918, while still a member of the Irish Party. Lynch's chance to play a role in the bigger stage finally came in 1918. What followed had the elements of a comic opera, with its absurd characters, unlikely plot, and farcical outcome. Lynch later likened himself to Figaro, who laughed lest he should weep, but that casts himself too much in the role of victim. While he was lambasted on all sides, he was to some extent the agent of his own misfortune. When the seriousness of the Ludendorff offensive became known in the spring of 1918, the cabinet decided to extend conscription to Ireland. The measure was part of a dual policy of home rule being offered as a sweetener. Faced with the resolute resistance of Irish nationalists, Lord French was sent to Ireland as a virtual governor. It was quickly decided to postpone the introduction of conscription pending restoration of order and a renewed voluntary recruitment campaign. If the requisite number of recruits and the figure 50,000 was sought, if that number were forthcoming by the 1st of October, then conscription would be abandoned. If not, it would be implemented regardless of the consequences. All this placed Lynch in a dilemma. He supported recruitment, but accepted the Irish Party position that conscription should be a matter for an Irish Parliament, and he joined his colleagues in temporarily withdrawing from the House of Commons. However, as he put it, the Germans were thundering at the gates of Paris, and there was a real fear that Germany might win the war, an outcome which Lynch considered would be catastrophic for Ireland and for civilization generally. Like George Bernard Shaw, he believed that refusing to fight for the cause of liberty, just because Britain was on that side, made no political sense. In his autobiography, Lynch suggests that the Irish Chief Secretary, Edward Short, was responsible for enlisting him to spearhead the new recruiting campaign in Ireland. It seems more likely that the initiative was taken by Lynch himself and directly with Lloyd George. While his credentials in the war were strong, Lynch's appointment as a colonel to recruit and lead an Irish regiment was quite remarkable. The reaction of the military authorities was understandably hostile. Lord French, who fought opposite Lynch in South Africa and who had more recently been the target of regular criticism from him, grudgingly acquiesced to the diktat of his political masters, but others in the War Office and Army headquarters in Ireland were openly critical. They did little to facilitate Lynch's work, where they did not actively obstruct it. Lynch formally submitted an application for a commission as colonel on the 21st of June, 1918. 3 days later, his appointment was approved, and a notification to that effect was placed in the London Gazette. There followed 3 months of confusion as the various arms of government tried to decide what his role was to be. Lynch insisted that he intended to raise a battalion and lead it to France. This was in part hubris, but he was convinced that the symbolism of an Irish battalion in Irish colours with Irish leaders would have a dramatic impact on recruitment. However, the military authorities harboured deep reservations about his suitability. The Adjutant General pointed out that he had no military training, quote, certainly as regards methods now employed in the British Army, and that it was unlikely that he would be accepted as a commander in the field. A further complication was that he was an MP, and the Army Council opposed any more MPs serving as officers on the active list. Frederick Shaw, Commander-in-Chief of the forces in Ireland, tersely informed the War Office that he would be glad to be told by whom the arrangements for Lynch's appointment were made, and that from a military point of view, he did not consider the raising of a special battalion either feasible or desirable. The War Office responded stating that it knew little or nothing of Colonel Lynch or what he's supposed to be doing, and pointed the finger at the Prime Minister and the Chief Secretary. A problem arose immediately as to whether he was to be a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, which was only resolved after political intervention. There was then a complication as to his salary and the appropriate outfit allowance. The rate was £20 if the officer was assigned to home duties and £50 if he was bound for the front. There were running battles too about his insistence that his mission would be adequately resourced. He requested the services of Private T.W. Stopps, who had been his private secretary before the war as a batman, and James O'Grady as his assistant. Both were agreed only after intensive lobbying at the highest level. He was also allowed the services of a journalist as a part-time publicity agent and the use of a car to support his duties. But what were his duties? Was he simply to assist in recruitment, or was he to raise and lead a new Irish regiment? The military authorities argued the former, but Lynch, with political support, insisted that it was the latter. When Lynch took up duties in early July, the military suggested that he should be attached to and answerable to the newly formed Irish Recruiting Council, which was staffed mainly by civilians. The council, for its part, saw this as akin to Greeks bearing gifts. Dublin Castle clarified that his role would be, quote, of a personal and independent character, but the council remained unhappy and suspected that the military had no intention of recruiting a new battalion. Colonel Reid Hyde of the IRC wrote a secret letter to the Minister for National Service, complaining that the situation was impossible and that Lynch was, quote, nobody's child. The impasse was finally broken on the 15th of August when Lynch was summoned to meet Lord Milner, Secretary of State for War. It was accepted that Lynch was indeed authorised to raise a battalion, but the hostility continued. Lynch recalled Riley that he had a free hand, quote, except of course in regard to any project that I might put forward, unquote. He and O'Grady calculated that in all 33 of their substantive proposals had been turned down. There were ongoing disputes about the uniform of the new brigade, where it was to be headquartered, and even what it was to be called. Milner thought that granting a different uniform would be difficult, but authorised consideration of a special cap or badges. It was decided that this could wait until the battalion had been raised, but that it should be located close to Lynch's West Clare constituency. Matters dragged on into September, when, following pressure from several directions, it was decided that the battalion should be attached, at least notionally, to the Munster Fusiliers and headquartered at Buttevant in County Cork. Instructions were given to prepare the necessary accommodation there. While the number of recruits at the time was deemed not to justify the establishment sought by the IRC, it was claimed that there were only 4 recruits by late September. Nonetheless, authorization was given for sufficient personnel to form a nucleus. The final establishment was to be that of an infantry battalion in France with 5 pipers, fewer than sought, but in line with a Scottish regiment. The battalion was to be called the 10th Service Battalion, Royal Munster Fusiliers, brackets, Lynch's Brigade. The reference to a brigade, of course, was militarily incongruous, but it was important to Lynch because of the historical precedents which he saw with the Wild Geese and the Boer War Irish brigades. It was proposed that the uniform would be that of the Munster Fusiliers, with the addition of a headdress in the colonial pattern with a green plume and the badge of an Irish harp. The tunic would have a green shoulder straps and the pipers would wear Irish kilts. However, the Army Council preferred a plume or hackle in green and white, the colours of the Munster Fusiliers, and a green band on the service hat rather than green shoulder straps, which would entail provision of a special jacket for one battalion. It was unwilling to accept a badge with a harp alone, but would tolerate a harp and a crown as a badge, as was worn by all Irish regiments. By now, Lynch had little to show for his efforts of recruiting for his brigade, except controversy which dogged his every step. He sought the assistance of local newspaper editors and of county councils and of local authorities, but was often rebuffed. He was in attendance at a meeting of Galway County Council on the 31st of July, along with Captain Stephen Gwynn and Sergeant Sullivan, KC. As a former MP for Galway, he might have expected a sympathetic response, but they were refused a hearing. This visit was part of a nationwide tour. 2 days later, Sergeant Sullivan was in Limerick addressing a public meeting at the Chamber of Commerce, while Lynch met prominent citizens in Wexford. More extensive tours were undertaken in September and October. Inevitably, such events generated protest and disruption by those opposed to recruitment. The Irish Times reported, quote, a veritable tornado of cheering and booing at a meeting in Dublin in late August. Lynch's attempts at speaking were drowned out by singing of the soldiers' song and shouts of "Up Dev" and "What about MacBride," the executed 1916 leader who, like Lynch, had fought for the Boers. Harry Boland orchestrated a campaign by the Irish volunteers to disrupt Lynch meetings. In seeking to change the public mood, Lynch was nothing if not creative. He unsuccessfully sought the loan of heavy tanks to create a spectacle. He sent appeals to Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and Marshal Joseph Joffre for cooperation in Irish recruiting and invited them to visit Ireland. In late August, in a move which echoed an appeal he issued during the Boer War, Lynch issued a call to Irishmen to raise a brigade to fight on the Western Front alongside the Americans, the French, the young men of Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Appealing to the best traditions and heroic deeds of Irish history, he emphasised that it was for Ireland he wanted the young men to fight, not for Britain. When his appeal gained little traction, he canvassed the scheme to allow Irish recruits to join American or French regiments. And while that seems a slightly absurd proposal with the unity of command, it was slightly less far-fetched than might appear. With the tide turning against the Germans, Lynch became increasingly frustrated that the war would be over before we'd get to the front. In early October, he issued another call to Ireland to throw in its lot with the Allies before it was too late. If it did, the Allies would, quote, see her right at the peace conference. A few days later, Lynch finally paid a quick visit to France and to the front. He spent 3 days at the front with Australian forces. In Paris, he met Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes at lunch with the British Ambassador Lord Derby. Inevitably, much of the lunch conversation focused on the American peace note and the general war situation. Lord Derby recorded in his diary that Hughes was, quote, very outspoken and thoroughly indiscreet. Lynch recalled, quote, a little animated banter between Hughes and myself, with Hughes saying he forgave Lynch. He forgave Lynch, presumably for his treason in South Africa. Lord Derby makes no mention of this, but recounts the conversation between his two guests about Ireland, in which their outlook was surprisingly similar. Lynch had been an outspoken critic of clerical influence in Irish politics, while Hughes had become embittered by Irish Catholic resistance to conscription in Australia, spearheaded by Archbishop Mannix. Lord Derby recorded, there was an intense bitterness on the part of both of them to the Roman Catholics, perhaps even more bitter on the part of Lynch than on the part of Hughes. Lynch said that if he was given a free hand, he believed he could settle the Irish question. On recruiting, Lynch was of the view that they wouldn't get the recruits they needed in Ireland. He regretted that the peace initiative had come when it did, because it would prevent conscription being imposed. He feared that if peace were to be made without Ireland having contributed its share to the war, it would undoubtedly militate against Home Rule. Interestingly, Hughes agreed with this view. He said that he had been a Home Ruler all his life, but he couldn't say that he would support it in the future. The mere fact of Ireland having kept out of this struggle prevented her being considered a nation. While Lynch's apparent support for conscription is explained by the dual policy, which promised Home Rule as a quid pro quo, it's surprising that he supported conscription, given that it was evident that by then the imposition of conscription in Ireland had become virtually impossible. Lynch was back in Ireland when the war ended on the 11th of November. He joined the large crowds which thronged College Green. Students from the Royal College of Surgeons organised a mock funeral with the effigy of the Kaiser draped in a Sinn Féin flag. In contrast to his reception some weeks earlier, Lynch was cheered and called upon to speak. "Barbarism is killed now and forever," he declared, before being carried shoulder high to Trinity College by soldiers in uniform. This was Arthur Lynch's last major public event in Ireland. He didn't contest his West Clare constituency for the Irish Party at the December election, standing instead unsuccessfully as a Labour candidate in London. The Army Council moved quickly to dismantle Lynch's brigade, such as it was. On the 25th of January, the GOC was informed that the battalion was to be disbanded forthwith, with warrant officers, NCOs, and men posted or transferred, reverting immediately to their original units, and recruits who had been enlisted directly being demobilized or posted to the 3rd Reserve Battalion or any other Irish regiment. Lynch himself was gazetted out of the army without even being informed. He learned of the event from the press. It was an ignominious end. In annoyance, he wrote to Winston Churchill, Secretary of State for War, complaining about how his efforts had encountered resistance from the War Office. He described the War Office and the Irish government as the last strongholds of prejudice, ignorance, and stupidity. Churchill responded briefly, apologising for the oversight and thanking him for the services rendered. If Lynch was disappointed at the lack of appreciation for Britain, it was more than he received from Ireland. The victory of Sinn Féin facilitated a collective amnesia about the war, or at least a misleading binary narrative, and an unduly simplistic characterization of those who had supported it. Lynch and those like him were readily pigeonholed as closet imperialists and West Brits. In the process, some of the richness and complexities of the Irish story have been lost. Thank you very much.